Hello, welcome to El Zoominario. Today we're very excited to have Johny Uelmen. Johny is from Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, a mid-sized town about an hour north of Madison. His mother is Mexican American and his father is German American. He completed his bachelor's in biology and two masters, entomology and epidemiology, from UW-Madison. He then completed his Ph.D. in epidemiology from the University of Illinois. Currently, Johny is an assistant professor of epidemiology in the Department of Population Health Sciences at UW-Madison. Thank you so much, Johny, for accepting this invitation.
Thank you, Claudia. This is really great. I watched a bunch of them since finding out about Zoominario, and they are great. So I hope to be at all of them in the future. So thanks for hosting and having me and doing this. And thanks for everyone for being here and tuning in and watching later. I am 3.5 months into my program as a new assistant professor at UW-Madison. I will briefly talk about kind of an overview of the major topics in the projects that I'm doing and interested in working on. Some of these are ongoing and some will be starting very soon. So I titled this kind of broadly as How Does Planetary and Wildlife Health Affect Human Health? And I'll just jump right into it. So in my field in disease ecology, we have this concept that has been getting a lot of traction lately. It's called this One Health idea. And One Health is this concept that the health of animals, humans, and our shared environments are all connected. So basically, when one of these is vulnerable, essentially all of us are. So it's kind of this concept to understand that like our health is not just the endpoint, it is linked inextricably to many other things. So with that premise, I talked about planetary health and what is this? And this is a common term also used in a slightly different way in a more ecologic sense, but very closely related to One Health. So planetary health is slightly different in that it is a transdisciplinary solutions-oriented construct or social movement. And the key here is that it focuses on the impacts of human disruptions to Earth's natural systems. And that in turn affects how the health of not just humans, but all life on Earth. So there's this emphasis on how humans affect the planet and in turn. So with that little nuance, that is essentially what I am interested in coming at that angle for diseases and how health is affected. Now, how do you measure planetary health? And there's no one right way to do that. I have 4 GIFs here, or short videos that just kind of show examples of depleting planetary health or ways that we are negatively affecting the planet. Again, anthropogenic, human-based. So this can range from forest fires and deforestation in the top to air pollution and smog and pollutants in the ocean. And the bottom right graph, hopefully you can see my cursor, shows where this is kind of an interesting model. It shows where plastics end up in the Pacific Gyre. So this ocean circulating path for about 10 years, and it kind of just sits there in this massive patch. So all of that combined, when we do irresponsible things as humans, whether it be carbon emissions, like not recycling or disposing of waste properly, or expanding and basically changing landscapes, it affects the wildlife that are in those shared ecosystems. Here are 2 graphs. The top one in the back here shows the total number of species that are threatened by the type of anthropogenic factor or force. So the largest one is crop farming, but it goes all the way down to drought. And these are all linked to human specific causes or specific or derived events. Down in the bottom now, again, those were total number of species that are vulnerable. At the bottom, right, this larger graph inset, this actually shows where we've lost species over time now since recording. And none of these numbers are great, but some of them are startling, and that should hopefully be kind of a wake-up call if it hasn't already. So this is trying to set this tone that what we do matters. And now, specifically, as a population health scientist, epidemiologist, I'm very interested in how infectious diseases, specifically zoonoses, are affected by these changes in the environment and how humans are altering our ecosystems. There's these terms that are called re-emerging and emerging zoonotic events. A zoonosis is a disease that is spread from an animal to a human. So this map is sort of famous in our field. This shows an overlay of human population by biodiversity, meaning how many species are out there, and then known zoonotic disease spillover events. Spillover is that carryover when humans get infected. This essentially, in a nutshell, is high risk elements, risk areas currently. And what I'm interested in is when we continue our trajectory, how does this change? Where do populations become vulnerable, increasingly more vulnerable? And also, where are populations of animals at risk? So with all of these diseases, about all human pathogens, 70% are zoonotic. And of those, 40% are vector-borne. And vector-borne diseases are anything that's spread from a arthropod vector, so a mosquito, a tick, fleas, etc. And vector-borne diseases are responsible for 2.5 billion cases of human illness and 2.7 million deaths worldwide. And this is mostly from a single type of arthropod, the mosquito. And of all infectious diseases, vector-borne diseases are increasing the most rapidly. Okay, now this talks about kind of my foundation of what I do. And my background, my foundational research subject areas, I call them. I have an epidemiology PhD and master's, and I have an entomology master's. But all the work is really kind of central and focused around GIS and spatial epidemiology, and forecasting and modeling. And with all of that, it's inextricably linked to ecology and evolution of pathogens, of transmission of people and environments and animals. So it's multifaceted, interdisciplinary. And I do these because I'm pursuing this question of how does environmental and climate change disturbance influence infectious diseases, and in turn, how does that affect the health of humans, animals, and our ecosystems? The point of doing this is that I want to forecast and model using complicated statistical methods. But the reason we do this is that if we have a strong model, then in theory, we can implement meaningful change and essentially minimize or mitigate disease risk. And that in turn should help improve the overall health of ecosystems and environments. And the idea is that humans aren't going anywhere, and we're only going to grow and take up more resources. So how can we live in harmony with the species around us and our environments? So I have a kind of a broad repertoire of backgrounds. It started off in insect phenology and development, and then I also work with environmental climate changes. I also, with COVID and influenza, I do a lot of work with respiratory virus epidemiology. Human health disparities and behavior is very focal to almost everything that I do. And then environmental sustainability is linked anthropogenic effects on one health, assessing health risks and impacts from natural disasters, again, stemming from climate changes. And then there's this last one I wrote because this is becoming a topic that is becoming more important that I didn't really understand through my training that is actually becoming very important. And that's scientific communication, effectively building trust and dismantling misinformation, but without, being attacking or disrespectful to all parties. All right, so mosquitoes. I mentioned I kind of transitioned to vector-borne diseases through all of this. I'm using mosquitoes as an example because I think they're one of the most important species that has co-evolved with us and is so important for our public health. And most of my PhD dissertation focused on mosquitoes and their diseases. So I'm going to just do a quick walkthrough of the life cycle of mosquitoes. Mosquitoes require water to develop. Most of their life cycle is actually in this water stage. And it's only after 4 or 5 of these I call larval instars, they end up emerging as adults, and that's where they bite us. And the females require blood to lay eggs and continue the life cycle. Like all arthropods, we call them ectotherms. This is a generic graph. Every single arthropod is essentially built off of this relationship. So temperatures are and abiotic forces, other ones, but we're going to stick with temperature for this example. Temperatures directly affect the development rate of arthropods and mosquitoes. So this here shows that as temperatures increase, the development rate of mosquitoes will also increase, meaning how quickly this cycle can proceed. In this example, there is about 27 degrees Celsius is called the thermal optimum. That is the optimum peak at which this mosquito or arthropod can can produce. But after it gets beyond that temperature, it ends up becoming detrimental, harmful, and even deadly. So there is this critical juncture. I will come back to that. Just keep that in mind with how temperature is related to the development. Specifically with the mosquito, there are multiple genuses and species of interest. For what I'm going to discuss, I'll talk about more regional here in the Midwest United States with West Nile virus, which is the most predominant mosquito-borne disease that we have. It's spread by what is called Culex genus, and here is a Culex pipiens specifically. So West Nile virus, if you aren't familiar, is a flavivirus that originated and was first documented in West Nile region of Uganda in 1939. Fortunately, 4 to 5 people who are infected don't even know they're infected or have very minimal symptoms. But of about 150 of those individuals infected, one will develop serious neurological or neuroinvasive infection, and that's a threatened further for death. And then since 1999, there's been over 52,000 cases and 2,500 deaths. This example, again, this sylvatic cycle in nature occurs between passerine birds and these Culex mosquitoes. But sometimes these mosquitoes, when they kind of build up in the environment, and this usually happens in July, August, late September, or late summer, is when they start to take other blood meals, meaning humans and horses are two examples, and we are considered dead-end hosts. So while we can get infected, and we meaning horses too, the virus cannot propagate, it cannot continue through our blood, our blood. The viremia does not continue. So like another mosquito cannot come and bite or bite us and continue the life cycle. But we can still get sick. And in fact, horses are much more vulnerable than we are, but there's a vaccine for horses. There's not one for humans. And then growing up in the Midwest, going to school in Illinois and Wisconsin, I did my field work here in Chicago. And Chicago is one of the hardest hit areas for West Nile virus in the United States. There are a lot of cases every year, and people really kind of wonder why, because it's sort of a temperate, kind of gets cold currently, but it also gets hot in the summer. And this area is part of this lowland elevation where this is the Illinois River and it feeds right into Lake Michigan. So you have the third most populated metropolitan area on top of this like urban jungle. It really kind of creates this environment that's perfect for that mosquito I had shown you. One of the methods I did for my field work was called a human landing catch. And what this is just a fancy way of saying you just kind of sit out in locations, strategic locations, and you have mosquitoes come, as shown here, and then we suck them up or aspirate them with this mechanical aspirator. And what we do is we take these mosquitoes then, and we can identify them and test them for pathogens, etc. And we did this because these mosquitoes are specifically looking for humans to bite on, and that's what we want. So out of 2 field seasons throughout Chicago, we spent a long time. I don't know if you saw, there's over 6,000 minutes, but in total, we only got 223 mosquitoes, which is not a lot. But when you look at the quality, though, these are all meaningful mosquitoes that wanted to bite people. And of these, 45 of them were this Culex species. This is the one that can spread West Nile virus. Within that was this Salinaria species, which was by far the most abundant. That's this species right here. And Culex salinarius is considered a salt-loving mosquito, but really it's not supposed to be found up in this part of the country. It's really supposed to be around the Gulf and the Atlantic shorelines. And it was found very abundant here and also in other places now later discovered throughout the upper Northwest or Midwest and Northeast United States. It's highly competent West Nile virus vector. It actually prefers to feed on mammals versus the other species which like to feed on birds. And it lives in wetlands and marshes, which aren't being treated by a lot of mosquito control. So it's kind of these 1, 2, 3 punch things that we're missing and have been for some time. So this was a potentially significant finding that people in Chicago, mosquito control, are actively now considering for part of their surveillance. So a big part of what I mentioned about modeling and forecasting is the GIS component. And here are 3 models of that Chicago region. This is the larger county area, and here's the locations. I did 2 of my field sites. And you can see that as resolution increases, so does the quality of the predictive models. But these are, I kind of breezed over, but there are something like 40 like independent covariates that go into our statistical modeling here, and it produces very high resolution, very detailed risk maps. And then switching to another project very quickly. This was transitioning now to the mosquito and climate change specifically. And I'm interested in how that optimal temperature I had mentioned earlier, how that might shift as temperatures are anticipated to warm. And here's that thermal optimum again. A colleague of mine established four species of Culex that can potentially spread West Nile, where that threshold might change as it gets warmer. So here's just one of those four species. This is Culex pipiens, again, the same mosquito I had been talking about. And this is anticipated climate change under the worst case emission scenario. So like we don't do anything with as far as stopping emissions of carbon. It just keeps happening. Here's the average anticipated between 2020 and 2040. This is by month. As the darker it gets, the more months are suitable. Here's current. Here is the midpoint of the century. So you can see a little bit of an expansion northward. But then where it really matters is here at the end of the century. Parts that are of northern Canada and Alaska have never seen these types of mosquitoes or these pathogens are now very, very accessible for the first time. So this brings along lots of complications, meaning the future of rapidly warming temperatures will likely increase animals that are naive immunologically to new pathogens, which are going to cause, and unfortunately, lots of death in a lot of these species and humans. I'm also working on what this is called a global mosquito observation dashboard, GMOD. I developed this in my postdoc at University of South Florida, and it's a citizen science-based dashboard that brings all mosquito data from several different apps around the world into one centralized place so that it can become an actable and accessible, free-to-use kind of focused area. And I have a QR code here, and I'm trying to promote it selfishly. But the idea is that we're trying to grow this, and I'm going to walk through this platform a little bit to show what the capabilities are. But again, I'm really proud of that I created it, but I'm hoping to expand this for greater public health use. So you can search by location, and each one of those dots is a single submission from a citizen scientist from one of these apps down below. And there's all these different factors you can look by. You can search by genus, species, and you can see it's global. And every day this is automatically fed. We get about 5,000 or so observations a day. It gets cleaned on the back end and pushed in. And then all this information is available for free to use for anyone. But the point where I'm trying to really take this to make it a strong benefit to public health is to find those mosquitoes that are submitted and determine what they are as far as a species in near real time. And to do that, we're trying to work on convolutional neural networking, artificial intelligence, to take images and use their pixels to determine what parts of mosquito are what. And essentially these are mini models that come out with a potential what species this might be. And this can help in turn with people who have this data to get a better sense of what is around them, if it's invasive, if it's medically important, and what that might mean for their risk. Lastly, I promise, I think I'm a little over, but I will finish this up quickly. I got approached by a archaeologist at a conference recently, and this is an exciting new kind of path that I never thought my field would go. But this is looking at modeling ancient malarial pandemics, and specifically this one would be in Athens, Greece, using paleopathology and paleoclimatology. And this example here shows all these different ice core samples, soils samples, all these different radiocarbon dating data sources that we can use to imply what temperatures and precipitation might have been hundreds, thousands of years back. And then with paleopathology, we actually have these bioarchaeologists that can actually look at samples of tooth pulp and bone, dense bone, where they can actually see plasmodium DNA still viable inside of these locations, so that it can actually extract this DNA and while they can't confirm that is what the cause of death was, it's highly likely and highly probable. So it's fascinating. So why do we study ancient malaria? Malaria is geographically very was widespread at one point in time. Even so, throughout North America and throughout Europe, there's been recorded outbreaks and epidemics. And recently, in fact, the last 2 to 3 years, there's been autochthonous, which means localized malaria and dengue transmission in the United States. Texas and Florida, Florida for sure, most commonly, but also even up in Maryland. So these are things that we're expecting to see more of. So focusing on this location in Athens, Greece, which is going to show here right here. This is called um, the so this is an ancient port of Athens. In this location are several mass graves, and unfortunately, these are mass graves of young children who tend to be the most vulnerable from malaria. And there is documentation stating this, and that ancient or paleo pathological data showing it as well. So what we're going to do is look and see if we can model what the environmental situations might have been around those times. And again, here's some ancient literature that shows what the environment looked like in these ancient ports. So this is 4,500 years before present. This used to be a lagoon. It was actually underwater in this ancient port. And then 2,500 years ago, this now became dredged and was part of a swamp. So you can see where I'm going with this. Knowing mosquito ecology, we have ancient Greek, ancient Athenians now altering their landscapes and becoming prevalent with lots of malarial epidemics. So that was a lot to cover, but in a nutshell, I hope I convince you why human anthropogenic effects really affect not just our health, but also the environmental health and animal health. So thank you. And I also have some additional slides, Claudia, to talk about briefly about my family, if that's still okay.
Yes, yes.
Cool. Should I just roll right into it?
Yeah, please, please go for it.
Okay. I'll make that quick. Um, okay, so I just had this one slide, but my my father is German American. They grew up nearby. So being at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, it's a fantastic school, but more importantly, I am from an hour north, an hour and a half north. This little red dot down here is Oakfield, Wisconsin. That's where I grew up. Up in the right corner is De La Rosa's restaurant. This is my mother's side. My grandma here and my grandpa, these are them here. They ran this restaurant. They're John and Pilar De La Rosa for 30 years. They did that in this small town of Oakfield because they chose Oakfield. They loved it. And it all started because my grandpa here was a supervisor for a migrant camp that had a program that they would sponsor Mexican migrants to come from various parts throughout Mexico, but they would come up to the Midwest seasonally and work in different types of agricultural settings. And Oakfield was one of the locations that had a canning company, still does. So they canned a lot of vegetables, primarily corn and soybean. But they did this for a decade or so, and rather than going back every year, they ended up liking the community so much that they ended up living here, and they chose a small town of 1,000 people. And in doing so, they pretty much blew up the cultural immersion for several of these pretty much heterogeneous like white populations, which is fine. But this was a kind of a beautiful thing where they just kind of culture clashed hard, and the community ended up absolutely adoring my grandma and grandpa. But this restaurant, I think, probably helped a lot. It was very popular in a small town. People used to come here from all over. It no longer is there. Our family did not continue. They all had an opportunity to, like my aunts and uncles, but they did this for years. And I should mention, while my grandfather was in charge of supervising the migrant camps, my grandmother used to cook for the entire camp. And I think putting these all together, it just kind of made like a natural progression, a natural sense. Um, so me, my cousins, my sister, we kind of grew up in a small town, and it was a very unique experience. And then coming to UW-Madison as an undergrad, of course, was this like massive change and something that I didn't really I took for granted. I didn't really know much about my own self, my own culture until I came to Madison and kind of found out a lot more and started to have a deeper appreciation of what my family and my grandparents what they did. So that's kind of a quick rundown of that.